Today on Professor Tom's Philosophy in 10, alien logic, human logic. A good friend of mine who is also a philosophy professor, let's call him Mark, not his real name, has for years maintained that he is an alien abductee. He's not joking. He's adamant that he was abducted multiple times while still a teenager, and then again several times while he was in college. He says that his memories of the events are mostly distorted, as if he had been given a sedative that didn't fully work, except for one instance, which he says that he remembers with complete clarity. Mark says that the aliens always seemed friendly and, aside from apparently drugging him and abducting him, didn't harm him. I mean, that seems like significant harm to me, but it's never bothered Mark. He is in fact quite insistent on this point. He says that there is no evidence that any strange operations were performed on him, no evidence of alien implants, no evidence of physical or psychological torture, nothing that would suggest that the aliens are dangerous or threatening to either him or humanity. Mark often says, "It's not like they said to me, 'We come in peace' or anything. Communication seems to be impossible between us and them, in fact. They just seemed curious and also a bit frustrated that it was impossible to talk with me." Mark's conclusion that they are not malicious seems to be based, for the most part, on his memories of the one abduction that he says he remembers clearly. That story is philosophically interesting, so I thought it would be worth passing on here to you. The abduction occurred one beautiful fall evening when Mark was a senior in college. He was walking home after an evening logic seminar in which the topic was the history of logic. Mark says that he remembers the twittering of chimney swifts darting overhead. This was late September, so they must have been getting ready to migrate. Mark then remembers walking under a large dark maple tree and then a blank. And the next thing he remembers is being seated in what looks like a caricature of a science fiction movie set, which turned out to be a room in an alien ship or craft of some sort. He assumes that it was a spacecraft, or as Mark says, more likely a space-time craft, since interstellar space travel at lower than light speeds would be impractical. The aliens were anisodactyl, had binocular vision, and seemed to be covered with what almost looked like downy feathers, which were slightly iridescent. The oddest thing about the whole situation to Mark was that the aliens had copies of Aristotle's works on logic, the Organon, in the original Greek and in English translation, and were holding them rather insistently in front of Mark with seeming hope, impatience, and a dash of what might have been despair. They were, to be precise, pointing to an example of an AAA Figure 1 categorical syllogism, and were emitting a multi-frequency buzz over and over, looking at Mark expectantly. Mark inferred that they wanted him to explain this bit of Aristotelian logic. And for those who are watching who haven't any knowledge of Aristotelian categorical syllogisms, an AA Figure 1 argument, also known since the Middle Ages as the Barbara syllogism, is an incredibly common form of reasoning and looks like this. All B are C, all A are B, therefore all A are C. A moment's reflection will tell you that it's closely related to the transitive property. If A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. Now, apparently, this simple bit of logic had stymied the aliens, and they wanted Mark to explain it to them. Mark wonders if perhaps the aliens had been guiding him for years, steering him toward a philosophy degree and toward an interest in logic in particular, so that eventually he would be able to explain the Barbara syllogism to them. Seems possible. The aliens, who by this time Mark had been thinking of as something like intelligent chimney swifts, and so was calling them chims in his head. The chims then produced an odd-looking device that projected what looked like a multi-dimensional image with all sorts of complex, unintelligible bits and pieces in it. Mark only guessed that it was multi-dimensional since he recognized at least 4 dimensions in a 3-dimensional representation of what looked like a 4-dimensional matrix, but he was just guessing and couldn't be sure. So Mark quickly came to believe that the aliens were having trouble understanding human logic and wanted him to explain it to them. So he set out to explain it to them, using only gestures and pointing to the logic texts. To make a long story short, Mark failed. No matter what he tried, it was an utter failure. After several hours of this, the aliens seemed to give up, crestfallen. Mark has not interacted with them since and has no evidence of any subsequent abductions. Mark is in fact convinced they actually left Earth after his last abduction, and he thinks that it was because they couldn't understand human logic and had failed to make Mark understand their logic. Now, Mark's story raises a really interesting philosophical question, one that has defined Mark's subsequent academic career. Are there some forms of logic that the human brain simply cannot grasp? And might some forms of human logic be completely out of the reach of alien brains? At first blush, the answer might seem like it must be no. Carl Sagan very famously argued in the Cosmos series and in his book and later great movie Contact that aliens and humans must share at least one very basic language, the language of mathematics. Any intelligent alien would have to understand the prime number sequence, for example, although they might have unusual ways of representing it, or they might think our ways of representing it are unusual, but the prime number sequence is the prime number sequence, apart from how it's represented. So Sagan concluded that it would provide a point of mutual intelligibility between us and any alien intelligences out there. Now, since logic is probably more fundamental than mathematics, wouldn't the same be true for logic? Mustn't any intelligent, space-time faring alien species be able to understand the Barbara syllogism? Can't we a priori classify logic as part of the universal language of all intelligences in the universe, alien or otherwise? Well, not so fast. Mark has developed an argument for why it's plausible to think that some intelligent aliens might not be able to understand human logic, and why humans might not be able to understand some forms of alien logic. The argument draws on the history of logic, so let me tell you here just a tiny bit about that history. Human beings have been using logic, and using it well, since the mists of prehistory. Reasoning is our superpower. It's a superpower that doesn't always work the way that it should, of course, but it's difficult to imagine our species actually surviving, much less flourishing, without the ability to reason and make mostly good inferences. But for most of the existence of Homo sapiens, people didn't really pay attention to the fact that they were reasoning. They would just reason, and when that reasoning went astray, they'd reason about that too without realizing that that's what they were doing. It's pretty weird. Human beings have mostly been blissfully unaware that there are underlying patterns to both good and bad reasoning. Aristotle changed this. Aristotle noticed that there are patterns to good and bad reasoning, and he explored them brilliantly. The result was a nearly fully developed formal deductive logic, now called Aristotelian or categorical logic. If this had been Aristotle's only achievement, and it wasn't, not by a long shot, but if this had been the only thing that Aristotle had ever done, we would still be fully justified in always referring to him as, say, that towering genius Aristotle, or, as St. Thomas Aquinas used to call him, just the philosopher. Aristotle may have done too good a job, however. For more than 2,000 years, Aristotelian logic so dominated things that no less a luminary than the German philosopher Immanuel Kant thought that Aristotle had perfected logic and that nothing more needed to be added and nothing taken away from it. It's perfect, he thought. Through the centuries, there were hints of other kinds of logic, however. The ancient Greek Stoic philosophers had, for example, a bit after Aristotle, actually developed a logic of whole sentences, much like modern propositional logic, which itself wasn't fully developed until the mid-20th century. Sadly, the early Stoic logic was neglected and then forgotten. Such was the power of Aristotle through the ages. But by the early 21st century, other forms of logic had been discovered and developed, including logics of necessity and possibility, logics with more than two truth values, fuzzy logics, and many others. Now, what does this history of discoveries suggest? First, note that Aristotle dominated everything until quite recently. Given that there are many forms of logic other than Aristotelian, this is kind of a stunning fact. It suggests that humans have for millennia used forms of logic, non-Aristotelian forms, without actually knowing that they're using these forms of logic. It suggests that there still may be ways that we reason that we haven't yet identified. In this sense, and in relation to these as yet undiscovered forms of logic, we are in the same position as prehistoric people were with regard to Aristotelian logic. Now, since there can be forms of reasoning that we use every day without realizing we're using them, why might there not also be forms of reasoning of which our brains simply can't make sense? So Mark has concluded that the aliens left Earth because their brains, or whatever they have that's the equivalent of a brain, are just not wired to understand human forms of logic. And they might also have left because they were disappointed to find that the human brain is equally incapable of understanding their forms of logic. I suppose that at this point I should tell you that Mark has been quite serious about his alleged abductions for decades now, but I'm not entirely convinced that he hasn't been pulling our legs for all these years. I wouldn't put it past him. Even so, his story, whether real or fictitious, raises two hugely interesting philosophical questions. First, do we reason in ways that we have not yet identified? That is, do humans use unrecognized forms of logic? Mark thinks, and I totally agree with him, that the answer here is almost certainly yes. The history of logic is a history of successive discoveries of ways of reasoning that we've been using all along without noticing them. That we would have identified all of them by now seems very unlikely, given that many of them have only been identified and formalized in the last couple of generations. And second, are there ways of reasoning that we simply cannot and will never be able to identify or understand? Are our brains wired so that we can only use some forms of reasoning, some forms of logic, and not others? That is Mark's story about alien abductions and their inability to understand the Barbara syllogism plausible? Mark is convinced that there are such unthinkable, unknowable forms of logic, and he is worried about the status of intergalactic relations as a result. I'm not convinced, but it sure is an interesting question. Perhaps somebody who works in Area 51 knows the answer to it.